For decades, George Benson has been celebrated as one of the greatest guitarists and vocalists of his era, a man whose smooth melodies and dazzling solos made him a household name. His voice could melt a crowd, his guitar could silence an arena, and his music carried a timeless elegance that seemed untouchable. But while the world admired his brilliance, a darker story was forming behind the scenes. For years, whispers surrounded him, rumors of conflicts, scandals, and secrets hidden in the shadows of his success. The truth, once shielded by fame, has finally surfaced, and it's far more unsettling than fans ever imagined. What exactly was George Benson hiding all along? Stay with us to find out. George Benson's story began like a fairy tale, the kind that seemed destined for greatness from the very first note. Born in Pittsburgh in 1943, he was a child who couldn't stay away from music. By the age of 8, while other children were running in the streets, Benson was already performing in nightclubs. Imagine the sight: a boy barely tall enough to hold a guitar, standing in smoky rooms filled with grown men, his small hands dancing across the strings with shocking maturity. He wasn't supposed to be there, yet nobody could deny the fire in his playing. It didn't take long for local crowds to realize they were witnessing something extraordinary. Benson's talent was raw, but it was also refined, almost supernatural. He could mimic the fluidity of seasoned jazz musicians, blending intricate runs with a soulful depth that made listeners stop mid-conversation. It was clear that this was not just a gifted child. This was a prodigy. Word spread quickly, and soon industry insiders began circling like vultures, ready to mold the boy into a star. But the music industry, especially in the 1950s and 60s, was no gentle place. Behind the glamour, it was a machine built on exploitation. And Benson, young and impressionable, would soon find himself caught in its gears. His first recordings showed incredible promise, but they also revealed something more troubling: the pressure placed on him to be perfect, to deliver not just as a musician, but as a product. That demand would follow him for decades, setting the stage for conflicts and compromises that fans never imagined. By the late 1960s, Benson's reputation was spreading beyond Pittsburgh. He was praised not just for his guitar, but for his voice, an unexpected weapon that record labels quickly recognized. Soon, Benson was everywhere, collaborating with giants like Miles Davis and Freddie Hubbard, while also carving out his own space in the world of jazz and soul. But with success came scrutiny, and with scrutiny came whispers. Some insiders claimed that Benson's rise was too polished, too carefully orchestrated, as if someone behind the curtain was pulling the strings. Then came the turning point, the mid-1970s. With the release of Breezin' in 1976, Benson crossed over from jazz circles into mainstream superstardom. The album sold millions, topping charts and solidifying him as a household name. Songs like This Masquerade didn't just win Grammys. They redefined what jazz could mean to the general public. But this monumental success had a shadow side. Purists in the jazz world accused him of selling out, of abandoning the raw, improvisational spirit of jazz for smoother, commercial sounds. Benson suddenly found himself torn between two worlds, adored by pop audiences but criticized by the very community that had once lifted him up. The pressure weighed heavily. Critics questioned his authenticity, while labels pushed him to go further down the road of commercial appeal. And though Benson smiled for cameras and dazzled audiences on stage, the tension behind the scenes was mounting. Was he the true jazz prodigy he had once been hailed as? Or was he now just another cog in the industry machine, reshaped to suit the tastes of the masses? This question haunted Benson's career, and it would come to define much of the controversy that followed him. What fans didn't realize at the time was that this shift, this compromise between artistry and commercial success, was not entirely Benson's choice. Industry pressures, private deals, and quiet manipulations had forced his hand. And as his fame grew, so did the hidden cracks in his carefully constructed image. George Benson had become a legend. But legends are never simple. And behind the golden records and glittering awards was a man whose story was far messier and far darker than anyone dared to admit. George Benson's stardom seemed untouchable by the late 1970s. He was everywhere, his silky vocals pouring from radios, his guitar riffs echoing through concert halls, his smile plastered across magazines. To the public, he embodied success, a shining example of talent rewarded. But behind that polished surface, there were cracks forming. Fame, as it so often does, carried secrets. And in Benson's case, the shadows around him grew darker with every hit song he released. From the very start, the industry demanded more from him than anyone realized. Benson wasn't simply expected to play guitar or sing. He was expected to represent an image. That image was carefully curated. The clean-cut, charming black artist who could appeal to both jazz purists and mainstream pop audiences. Yet the truth was that Benson was trapped. Every performance, every interview, every photo shoot was orchestrated, and Benson quickly learned that stepping out of line came with consequences. One of the biggest secrets buried beneath Benson's success was the relentless pressure of record labels. Warner Brothers had discovered they could make millions off him, but only if he kept producing the same kind of polished, radio-friendly songs that had made Breezin' a phenomenon. What the public didn't see was the internal battle raging inside Benson. He longed to return to raw, improvisational jazz, the kind of music that had first defined him, but executives tightened their grip, insisting that he remain in the smoother lane of crossover hits. He was their golden goose, and golden geese were not allowed to fly wherever they pleased. The toll on his personal life was staggering. While fans pictured Benson as a man living a dream, the reality was far different. Endless tours, rehearsals, and studio sessions left him exhausted. Friends later admitted that he seemed worn down, almost hollow, despite the wealth and applause. His family life suffered too, as the constant demands of fame left little room for rest, much less privacy. And yet, Benson rarely spoke of these struggles publicly. He wore the mask of success so convincingly that even his closest supporters often failed to see the weariness behind his smile. But the shadows weren't only about exhaustion. Rumors began to swirl within the music world. Some whispered about financial mismanagement, others about industry figures who had exploited his trust. Benson, like many artists of his generation, signed contracts that seemed generous at first, but came with hidden clause. Behind closed doors, he fought to protect his earnings, his legacy, and his independence from the very people who claimed to support him. These quiet battles left scars that audiences never saw, yet they shaped the man behind the guitar. There was also the matter of respect, or rather, the lack of it. While Benson sold millions of records, he never fully escaped the criticism that dogged him from jazz purists. They dismissed his mainstream success as pandering, accusing him of abandoning true artistry. Critics wrote scathing reviews, questioning his credibility, even mocking his polished sound. For Benson, it was a painful paradox. He had achieved everything most musicians could only dream of, and yet he was haunted by the feeling that he had lost something along the way. Privately, Benson confided in friends that he sometimes felt like an outsider in both worlds. Pop fans loved him, but often didn't understand the depth of his musicianship. Jazz purists knew his brilliance, but rejected the direction of his career. He lived in a strange middle ground, celebrated yet alienated, adored yet criticized. And all the while, the industry continued to tighten its grip, pushing him further from the freedom he craved. The irony was undeniable. The man whose guitar spoke with such freedom on stage was, in reality, trapped behind the curtain. Each new hit brought applause, but it also reinforced the chains that bound him to a carefully managed image. And while the spotlight shone brighter, the secrets grew heavier. By the early 1980s, Benson's fame was at its peak, but so too was the pressure. The industry machine demanded constant output, and whispers of exploitation followed him wherever he went. To the outside world, he was living a dream. To those who looked closer, the cracks in his story were impossible to ignore. George Benson had become more than a musician. He was a symbol. But symbols are fragile, and the truth behind them often reveals something far less glamorous. And as the years went on, it became clear that Benson's greatest battle wasn't with his guitar, or even his critics. His greatest battle was with the very system that had made him a star. By the time the 1980s rolled in, George Benson had everything the world thought a musician could ever want. Platinum records lined his walls, award shows called his name, and stadiums erupted whenever he stepped onto the stage. To the casual observer, his life was nothing but a symphony of glory. Yet beneath the applause, a darker melody played, one composed not of jazz chords, but of contracts, manipulation, and exploitation. The industry had George Benson in its grip, and it wasn't letting go. The music business in those days was notorious for its ruthless tactics. Record labels and managers built empires by squeezing artists dry, and many musicians, especially black musicians, were caught in the trap. Benson was no exception. Behind the curtain, deals were inked that looked generous, but bled him of control. Every album he released, every tour he embarked upon, seemed to deepen his entanglement with executives who saw him less as a man and more as a commodity. At the heart of it all was money. Big money. Benson's albums weren't just selling, they were dominating. Breezin' had become a global sensation, and follow-up records like Give Me the Night kept him at the top of the charts. But the fortune that should have secured his independence was always out of reach. Hidden fees, endless percentages, and murky financial clauses ensured that others grew richer off his talent than he did. Insiders whispered that Benson had to fight tooth and nail just to reclaim a fair portion of what was rightfully his. The glamour of his success concealed an ugly truth. He was being drained by the very machine that celebrated him. The grip wasn't just financial, it was creative. The same executives who profited from his voice and guitar also dictated how they would be used. Benson wanted to dive back into the depths of jazz, to let his guitar tell stories unbound by radio formulas, but the industry had tasted the sweet profit of his crossover appeal, and they refused to let him wander. Smooth ballads, polished love songs, catchy hooks, those were the orders handed down. And if Benson wanted to stay at the top, he had to comply. His artistry became a battlefield, with every decision weighed against what would sell. This manipulation extended into his personal image as well. George Benson the man was forced to become George Benson the brand. He was expected to always smile, always charm, always represent the ideal entertainer who could fit into any audience's expectations. That pressure was suffocating. The human being behind the guitar, a man with doubts, frustrations, and private struggles, was pushed aside for a glossy version the world was allowed to see. The impact on his spirit was undeniable. Friends later recalled that Benson grew weary, sometimes withdrawn, burdened by the knowledge that his destiny wasn't entirely his own. He had tasted freedom as a young jazz prodigy, improvising with abandon in Pittsburgh clubs, But that freedom had been steadily stripped away. Now, in the peak of his fame, he was caged by obligations, contracts, and expectations. And yet, Benson kept playing. He kept singing. He delivered performances that audiences adored, even as he felt the walls closing in. But behind closed doors, there were moments of rebellion. Stories surfaced of heated arguments with executives, of Benson pushing back against the manufactured image being forced upon him. He wasn't content to simply roll over, but the cost of fighting was steep. Every battle risked alienating the very machine that had built him. The darkest part of the industry's grip was how invisible it was to fans. To the public, George Benson was a success story, a man who had risen from nothing to conquer the world stage. Few saw the manipulation behind the curtain, the vultures circling, the quiet exploitation that drained his joy. This disconnect between the myth of his life and the reality of it haunted him. By the end of the 1980s, Benson's relationship with the industry was one of both dependence and resentment. He needed its machinery to stay visible, yet he despised the control it held over him. It was a prison made of gold records, a cage lined with applause. And though the world cheered louder than ever, Benson knew the truth. His greatest enemy wasn't a critic, or a rival, or even himself. His greatest enemy was the very system that had lifted him into the spotlight. George Benson was at the height of his powers, but also at the mercy of a machine that valued profits over people. And as the years moved forward, the tension between artist and industry only deepened, pulling him closer to the scandals and revelations that would later define his story. By the 1990s, George Benson had already secured his place in music history. His albums were classics, his voice unmistakable, his guitar work the envy of his peers. To the casual fan, his career appeared unstoppable, gliding on a smooth current of fame and respect. Yet those who paid closer attention knew that the surface was deceptive. Behind the polished veneer, whispers had begun to swirl, rumors that hinted at controversies Benson would have preferred to keep buried. And slowly, those whispers grew into something far more dangerous. A scandal that threatened to rewrite his legacy. The rumors began innocently enough, as they often do. Some said Benson had grown distant from his bandmates. Others hinted at disagreements over money. But soon, the speculation grew sharper. There were stories of backstage disputes, tense recording sessions, and a temper that flared when Benson felt cornered. Musicians who had once praised his generosity began to speak, in hushed tones, of a man wearied by fame and embattled by distrust. To some, he was no longer the prodigy with a golden touch, but a guarded figure constantly looking over his shoulder. One of the loudest whispers concerned his finances. Despite his staggering success, there were murmurs that Benson wasn't nearly as wealthy as he should have been. Insiders claimed that questionable contracts and bad management had drained much of his fortune, leaving him scrambling to secure stability even at the height of his fame. For a man whose music had generated millions, the thought of financial trouble seemed absurd. And yet, in the world of entertainment, it was a story heard too often. Brilliant artists left vulnerable by those who promised to protect them. The gossip didn't stop there. Some critics began to question Benson's artistic choices with increasing intensity. As his sound grew smoother and more commercial, many accused him of abandoning the authenticity that had first defined his career. For jazz purists, Benson had committed the ultimate sin, betraying the spirit of improvisation for the lure of radio-friendly hits. Words like sellout began to follow him, whispered in the same breath as his name. And while audiences continued to cheer, Benson himself couldn't escape the sting of those accusations. But perhaps the most damaging rumors of all were the ones that involved his personal life. Benson was notoriously private. a man who kept his family out of the spotlight and rarely spoke of his relationships. Yet that very secrecy invited speculation. Reporters claimed there were tensions behind closed doors, struggles with the weight of fame that bled into his most intimate spaces. Some even alleged that his relentless touring schedule had left fractures at home, though Benson himself rarely addressed the matter publicly. The silence, intentional or not, allowed gossip to flourish unchecked. Then came the scandal that forced its way into the open. By the mid-1990s, stories emerged suggesting that Benson had been misled by managers and business partners who had siphoned away staggering sums of money. Lawsuits followed, dragging his name into headlines for reasons that had nothing to do with music. For fans who had only ever known him as the man with the golden guitar, the revelations were shocking. How could someone so successful be so vulnerable? How could a legend find himself entangled in betrayal so brazen? The impact was immediate. The industry that had once celebrated him now looked at him with suspicion. Newspapers painted him as careless, a star who had lost his grip on reality. For Benson, it was a humiliating blow. He had spent decades crafting a pristine image of sophistication and control, only to watch it crumble under the weight of scandal. The whispers that had once circulated in private were now headlines read by millions. Yet even in the midst of the storm, Benson kept playing. He released albums, toured tirelessly, and leaned into his music as both shield and salvation. On stage, his performances retained their brilliance, but offstage, the scars deepened. Friends said he carried himself with a newfound heaviness, a man who had learned that success does not protect against betrayal. The scandal may not have destroyed his career, but it marked him. It revealed the vulnerability behind the legend, the human cost of living under constant pressure and scrutiny. George Benson was still a star, but the world could no longer pretend he was untouchable. The whispers had become truths, and the truths had exposed a reality no fan ever expected to see. By the late 1990s, George Benson had weathered storms that might have sunk lesser artists. He had survived industry exploitation, financial betrayal, and harsh criticism from purists who saw him as a sellout. Yet just when fans thought the worst had passed, new revelations surfaced, truths that shook the foundation of his carefully built legacy. What had once been whispers were now laid bare, and the world was forced to confront the unsettling reality of George Benson's story. The truth was this: Benson's career had been shaped as much by manipulation as by music. For decades, record executives had dictated his path, pressuring him to abandon raw jazz for smoother, more profitable sounds. While his hits filled charts and his concerts sold out, Benson privately admitted that many of those choices weren't entirely his own. The image of the confident, smiling star belied the fact that he often felt powerless in the face of corporate demands. The very system that celebrated him had boxed him into a corner. But it wasn't only his artistic freedom that had been compromised. Financial investigations revealed a staggering reality. Benson's fortune, once thought untouchable, had been siphoned away through shady contracts and unscrupulous managers. Lawsuits in the late 1990s and early 2000s painted a grim picture of mismanagement. Millions of dollars had vanished, lost not because Benson wasn't successful, but because he had trusted the wrong people. For fans, the idea that a man who had generated so much wealth could be left scrambling was nothing short of heartbreaking. The press was merciless. Headlines accused him of carelessness, of being too naive to handle his own empire. Critics who had once attacked his music now attacked his judgment, painting him as another cautionary tale of a star blinded by fame. Benson, a man who had built his career on discipline and precision, suddenly found his name entangled in narratives of scandal and failure. And yet, amid the financial chaos, another truth surfaced, one that cut deeper than any lawsuit. Benson himself admitted that the constant pressure to please everyone, the labels, the critics, the fans, had taken a personal toll. He confessed to years of inner conflict, of nights spent wondering if he had betrayed the very art form that had first given him life. The jazz prodigy from Pittsburgh had dreamed of freedom, of pure expression, but the reality was compromise after compromise. Each radio hit carried a shadow, a reminder of the authenticity he had been forced to sacrifice. The revelations sent shockwaves through the music world. Jazz purists felt vindicated, claiming the truth proved what they had suspected all along, that Benson had been pushed into commercialism, a pawn of corporate greed. Pop fans, meanwhile, were stunned to learn how little control their beloved star had truly possessed. The man they thought had it all had, in fact, spent decades fighting battles most never saw. The most haunting question became unavoidable. What was George Benson's legacy now? Was he the trailblazer who brought jazz to mainstream audiences? Or was he a cautionary tale of an artist consumed by the machine? The truth, uncomfortable as it was, suggested he was both. His genius was undeniable. His guitar solos, his velvety voice, his showmanship. But so too was the exploitation he endured, the compromises that haunted him, and the scandals that stained his journey. For Benson himself, confronting this truth was bittersweet. In interviews, he began to speak more openly about the challenges he had faced, peeling back the glossy image to reveal the scars beneath. He no longer denied the manipulation or the financial struggles. Instead, he acknowledged them, framing his survival as a testament to resilience. He was bruised, but not broken. Yet even as he embraced honesty, the revelations ensured his legacy would forever be complicated. No longer could George Benson be remembered simply as the smiling virtuoso whose music brought joy to millions. Now, he was also a symbol of the darker side of fame, of the sacrifices demanded by an industry that prizes profit over people. By the dawn of the 21st century, Benson stood as both legend and cautionary tale. His music still filled concert halls, but the truth behind his journey had left a permanent mark. Fans could never again hear his smooth melodies without also hearing the echoes of the battles he fought behind closed doors. And as the full scope of his story emerged, one thing became painfully clear. George Benson's legacy would forever carry both brilliance and betrayal, a duality that no amount of fame could erase. For decades, George Benson was celebrated as a figure of elegance in music, a man whose guitar and voice flowed effortlessly into history. But when the final pieces of his story emerged, the picture was not one of effortless genius. It was one of survival, of compromise, and of truths hidden too long. The final revelation about Benson's career did not simply surprise, it unsettled. It forced the world to question not just his legacy, but the cost of fame itself. The revelation was this: George Benson's greatest enemy was never a rival musician, never a critic, never even his own doubts. His greatest enemy was the very system that crowned him a star. For years, fans believed Benson's story was one of triumph, of a prodigy who rose from Pittsburgh streets to international stardom. But the reality was that his triumph came at a price so steep, it redefined what success truly meant. Insiders confirmed what Benson had long hinted at. He had been locked in an endless tug-of-war between artistry and control. Every chart-topping single carried behind it a battle. Every album that leaned toward commercial pop, rather than raw jazz, carried the fingerprints of executives demanding what would sell. The revelation was not simply that Benson compromised, but that he often had little choice. His career was shaped less by creative freedom than by an industry determined to mold him into a commodity. Even more disturbing were the financial truths that emerged in the final chapters of his career. Lawsuits and court documents laid bare how millions had vanished, siphoned away through contracts stacked against him. The public, who had assumed Benson's life was paved with luxury, learned instead that he had been cheated, manipulated, and forced to claw back pieces of what was rightfully his. This wasn't just negligence, it was systemic exploitation, the kind that destroyed countless artists of his generation. But the deepest wound was personal. Benson admitted in later interviews that the pressures of maintaining his image, of living up to the demands of both fans and executives, had often left him feeling hollow. He confessed that there were moments when he questioned everything: his music, his identity, even his faith in those around him. For a man who appeared untouchable on stage, these revelations exposed a vulnerability fans had never seen before. The final revelation also reframed his legacy. No longer could his story be told as simply one of jazz brilliance or crossover success. It had to be told with the darker truth that his genius was consistently undermined by forces beyond his control. For every dazzling guitar solo, there was a compromise hidden beneath it. For every chart-topping hit, there was a deal signed under pressure. His legacy was no longer just music. It was a cautionary tale of how the industry consumes its brightest stars. And yet, Benson's survival became its own form of triumph. Unlike many who were crushed completely by exploitation, he endured. He continued to perform, to release music, to remind the world of the genius that could not be erased. His resilience in the face of betrayal and loss became the final chapter of his story. But it was not a happy triumph. It was bittersweet. He had kept his place in history, but the cost of holding it was etched into every note he played. The world finally understood that George Benson's story was not the glossy fairy tale they had believed. It was something far more human and far more tragic. The revelation that he had been molded, manipulated, and misled for decades didn't just alter his image. It forced fans to look at the music industry itself and to question how many other stars had been forced into the same silent suffering. In the end, George Benson's mystery wasn't about talent or fame or even scandal alone. It was about the truth of what lies behind the curtain. The smooth melodies, the joyful performances, the brilliance of a man whose guitar could sing like no other. All of it was real. But so too were the shadows, the betrayals, the compromises that fans never saw. That was the revelation, and it wasn't good. It was the story of a man who gave everything to music, and in return was both celebrated and consumed by it. George Benson's story proves that even legends are not spared the ruthless grip of fame and industry control. Behind every smooth melody was a hidden struggle that reshaped his legacy forever. What do you think of his revelations? Share your thoughts, and don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories.